Pleasure of introducing Charles Birch. Charles is trained as a population ecologist, but like Charles Hartshorne, whose life and achievements we celebrated on Sunday, Charles Birch is also known for two vocations. He's equally well known around the world as a theologian. And he has been, in that capacity, very important for many people on an individual level. For example, when I first began teaching at the University of Dayton, I used Charles's little book on God and nature, and I've used it many times since. More globally, he has been important in the World Council of Churches. I think it's fair to say that the emphasis, somewhat belated but now strong by the World Council of Churches on sustainability and the integrity of creation, is due largely to the influence of Charles Birch. In that regard, his book that he co-authored with John Cobb is his most important achievement, The Liberation of Life. I think partly in recognition of that book and his work in the World Council of Churches, a couple years ago he received the coveted Templeton Prize, which for those of you who don't know is a very big prize indeed, $600,000 and some. He did have to share it with another person, so he only got $300,000, poor soul. But generous soul that he is, he promptly gave it all away to three of his favorite nonprofit organizations. Fortunately, one of those is the Center for Process Studies. He gave us $100,000, $50,000 outright, and $50,000 in a challenge grant. I mentioned that because some of you have asked if the grant is still going on. Do you still have a chance to contribute? Yes, just barely. We reached almost $38,000 last week, and then today we received an anonymous $5,000 gift, so we're up to $4,300, and now I've just received another pledge for $500 over the next 5 years. So you can still join in the bandwagon.
We also received $100 right after breakfast.
Great, great. We're on a roll, so don't you too. Don't you Well, so for that, we're extremely grateful to Charles. I've also found out that in Australia, he's very well known. I was on the airplane one day and started talking to the fellow next to me and found out this fellow was from Sydney. Well, you know, I thought, well, no, of course he wouldn't know Charles Birch. That's a big town. And then found out he was at the University of Sydney, but I still didn't want to ask because that's a big university. But finally I got up my nerve and I said, any chance you know Charles Birch? And he exploded. He said, Charles Birch, everybody knows Charles Birch. And as a sign of that, his latest book, called On Purpose, has already sold, I believe, over 10,000 copies in Australia, and in the United States, I think it's sold 3 copies already or so. Well, it was misnamed here. I point that out because Charles was very unhappy with the name. It's called A Purpose for Everything, and he's not sure there is a purpose for everything. And it was a title imposed upon him. So that's one of the things there's no purpose for, is that title. Well, Charles, we're very thrilled to have you here.
Thank you very much, David. I feel that at the end of this address I should have a Billy Graham sort of appeal for a few more contributions. I should tell you that I'm not used to handling large sums of money, and when I travelled with this cheque from Buckingham Palace to New York, I wanted to deposit it in the bank straight away, this $300,000. So I went into this first bank I saw, Citibank in Fifth Avenue, and I said, I want to open an account. And the chap said, what do you want to open it with? And I very proudly produced this cheque for in English pounds, you see. And he said, oh, I can't accept that. And I said, isn't it enough for this bank? And then he said, do you have $10? So I gave him $10. Just before I left Sydney, there was there's a weekly magazine, a bit like Newsweek there, called The Bulletin, and the sacked Minister of Science, previous Minister of Science in the federal government, who had also been a quiz kid, had selected about a dozen Australians that were off the mainstream in a sort of in sorts of ways. I mean, the implication was that they were rather screwballs, and I was one of these. And the caption that he gave me was, he argues that God is changing, is by no means omnicompetent, and is going through a particularly bad time at present. I think it's a fairly true statement, actually. A recent issue of the scientific journal Nature, which is really the leading weekly scientific journal in Britain, and well known in this country, contained a review of a book called Darwin on Trial by somebody called Philip Johnson. Now, the book was reviewed in Nature by David Hull of the Department of Philosophy of Northwestern University, and his review contained this statement, and I quote, "Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the data of natural history may be like, he is not the Protestant God of wait not. He is not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. He is also not a loving God who cares about his productions. He is not even the awful God portrayed in the book of Job. The God of the Galapagos Islands," a lot of studies on the Galapagos Islands about evolution, "the God of the Galapagos Islands is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He is certainly not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray." End of quote. I am a little surprised that the author of this statement is a philosopher. I would not have been surprised had it been written by a scientist, since I hear that objection about almost every day. And what really surprises me is that so many people in the modern world, in the scientific community and in the theological community, have no idea that there are alternatives to the dominant concept of theism in the world, which is promulgated over television stations and in mainline churches and so on. It reminds me of the story of the professor who had a visitor to his apartment, and at the end of going around the department, the visitor said, "And how do you examine the students?" And the professor said, "That's very easy. We ask the same questions every year." Whereupon the visitor said, "But doesn't that make it rather easy for the students?" And the professor replied, "No, we change the answers." And the point is, the answers are changing, and people don't know about this, and it's tremendously important that they know about it. I want to tell Professor Hull that the answers about God and evolution have changed since Darwin made the same objection as Hull is making today. He quotes Darwin. This is Hull quotes Darwin, who said, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the ichneumonidae, they're little wasps that sting caterpillars, and the eggs of the wasp hatch into little caterpillars inside the caterpillar and eat it, and destroy it. I cannot believe that a God would have designedly created these wasps with the expressed intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars." End of quote. And for good measure, Hull tells us about the queens of a particular species of parasitic ant that have a remarkable adaptation. This is a parasitic species, it goes into nests of other ants, and the remarkable adaptation is a serrated appendage which they use to saw off the head of the host queen. The implication is, how could a beneficent God ever have created a creature like that? Yes, it is true. Nature is wasteful, on the face of it, even diabolical, cruel, seemingly indifferent to causing pain. Professor Holmes Rolston III, I think, is that right how you pronounce it, when he's got 3 after his name, has written, if God, he's the professor of philosophy up in Fort Collins, if God watches the sparrow fall, God must be watching from a great distance. End of quote. A statement, incidentally, which stimulated one of your students, one of John Cobb's PhD students now in Arkansas, to write a book which has the title Of God and Pelicans. I mean, it could have been Of God and Sparrows, but he has an interesting example about pelicans in there. Now, I would say that what Darwin said, that if God is omnipotent, this is what Darwin eventually implied, if God is omnipotent, then that God is also cruel and apparently indifferent to suffering. I too cannot believe in a God like that. And what sort of prayer would one render to that God? There are so many gods I cannot believe in. Now, Hull's objection is precisely Darwin's objection, and it led Darwin to look beyond the omnipotent God of classical theism, and he could find nothing. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. He didn't get any help from any church in his search. Now, I had a similar experience to Darwin as a graduate student, and I too didn't find much help from the mainline churches, because they didn't take science seriously in their formulation of any notion of God. And where did I find it? I found it right here in process theology that emanates from this centre. For me, the adventure began with Whitehead's Science in the Modern World, which is a very serious book about evolution. Then I discovered Charles Hartshorne well before he wrote Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes, in which this particular issue that I started with is so well dealt with in detail. And in these more latter days, it's been John Cobb and David Griffin. In fact, David Griffin should have given this address. I hope you've read his paper he gave to the Nobel Conference 2 years ago in Augustus Dolphus College or something. The title of the book is The Restless Universe, the Restless Earth, rather, The Restless Earth. David has gone in great detail into a lot of these issues. Now I want to say something about Darwin and what David would call supernaturalist theism. Now, pretty well all the great English naturalists about the time of Darwin and the century before were theists. Darwin himself was a theist. As a student in Cambridge, he tells us that he tells us that he had read all the books of he'd read the work of Paley's Natural Theology, as every student in Cambridge had to do until about 1921. It was part of the required education of a student going to Cambridge. He was very impressed by its arguments, the arguments of God from design. God was the beneficent creator who designed all these creatures with their wonderful adaptations, and this was part of the evidence for God in the whole of creation. It was called by a much more recent Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge, the doctrine of divine carpentry. It was a very good image. God the carpenter makes the creation, then leaves it because the table that is made doesn't need any more intervention. The doctrine was promulgated in the 19th and 20th century, the first part of the 20th century, by bishops from their pulpits, and students at great universities were expected to believe in it. Scientists were expected to provide more and more evidence for it, and in that respect, Darwin became a traitor. He became a traitor because following the voyage of the Beagle around the world, in which he made all sorts of observations on the natural world and began to change his view of the origin of diversity of life on this planet, in other words, the source of order of nature, he began to change his view, and he found that supernaturalist theism had too many problems for the interpretation of the sort of nature that he was discovering as a naturalist on his voyage around the world. And I think there are three main points that disturbed him. The first was, instead of the world and all its inhabitants having been made out of nothing through instant acts of creation, Darwin showed that nature was not made once and for all complete and perfect, but was was in process of still being made and always had been. It was a process which was continuous. And his theory was a process of continuous creation, in a sense, which later became called evolution. That's the first point. The second point is, instead of nature being benign, evolution involved a struggle for existence, the phrase he got from Malthus. Most of the creatures that are born into the world would never see the light of day. And Tennyson called it the doctrine of nature red in tooth and claw. And the third point, so the second point is struggle and cruelty. The third point is evolution by natural selection of chance variations involved, as the word says, chance. And that seemed to be in opposition to the concept of an all-powerful designing creator of it all. The doctrine of evolution by natural selection, Darwin's concept, is basically a simple one. It's the notion of you have a great deal of variation being constantly produced amongst creatures on the planet, and some of them are well adapted, some of them not so well adapted, and the ones that are adapted survive and reproduce. That is natural selection. In fact, the concept's so simple that Thomas Henry Huxley, who became the great promulgator of Darwinism at the time, said, fancies no one having thought of that before. In fact, people had thought of that before, but they hadn't sort of developed it. Darwin gave the evidence to say, this has to be taken very seriously. That's the important thing about Darwin. Now, the extraordinary thing is that despite the role that Darwin attributed to chance variation, all this variation being a sort of chance phenomenon, nobody designed it. It just came as a matter of chance, according to his concept. Darwin was unable comfortably to accommodate this notion of chance into his whole thinking. And the person who more than anybody else has analysed that by looking at correspondence of Darwin to various people in various parts of the world is Charles Hartshorne. And Charles Hartshorne, I think, more than anybody else, has given us a good picture of the problem that Darwin himself had with the notion of chance. Because Darwin basically, it seems, wanted to be a sort of Newton. At least his concept of himself as a scientist, a good scientist, was to be what Newton was to physics or the cosmology. He wanted to be, perhaps unconsciously, the Newton of biology. In other words, to find laws of nature that were completely deterministic and left nothing to chance. And yet, here in the background always was the picture that a lot of it seems to be chance, and he struggles and struggles with this idea. The universe must be determined. But where is it? Where does this notion of chance come in? And some of his letters are very poignant in the struggle, particularly those he wrote to the professor of botany in Harvard at the time, Asa Gray. For example, I cannot think that the world is a result of chance, and yet I cannot look at each separate thing as a result of a design. I am and shall ever remain in a hopeless muddle. And somewhere else he uses the phrase, I am just in mud, and I can't get out of it. He couldn't resolve the problem. A deterministic world, it ought to be really, and it's a design world, and yet it looks as though there's chances here and there. And then he suggests, well, perhaps what I see as chance is simply I haven't found the basic causes, the deterministic causes of those particular events. And Charles Hartshorne in 1962 made two suggestions of Darwin's dilemma. The first was, Darwin tended to think of science committed to determinism, what I meant when I said that Darwin was thinking of himself as a sort of Newton. Now, the word chance doesn't refer to the absence of any determining cause, but to human ignorance of causes. That was what Darwin was sort of wondering about. The second point that Hartshorne makes is that it wasn't apparent to Darwin why, if there were a God, if there were cosmic purposes, why that God should leave anything to chance. Because God was identified with absolute law and non-chance. And the supernatural theism, or the supernaturalist theism of Darwin's day, was no help to him at all in that respect. God must do everything or nothing. If God was responsible for everything, then why all the evil? Why these wasps that go around killing other poor little innocent caterpillars? And it's because of the role of chance, which is so important in the modern understanding of Darwinism, that biologists like Jacques Monod, the great French biologist, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Dawkins, and many others reject theism resoundingly. I mean, just if anyone who's here, Richard Dawkins, speaks, know how emotional and how emphatic he becomes as an evangelist for a completely very atheistic way of looking at creation. And we were talking this morning about, or last night really, about cultural viruses. And he talks about, as we were talking about cultural evolution, he talks about cultural viruses. And religion is a cultural virus. It's just like a virus that gets into society and it multiplies itself and it does damage all over the place. That's a very interesting image. I think he's writing a book right now called Cultural Viruses. A very, very nice term. I think it's very important to have the right terms. That's why I was sort of mentioned this notion that the new neo-Darwinism, I think we ought to call it, the extended neo-Darwinism. It's very important to have something that really explains the situation without too much of asking of questions. Now, there was one of Darwin's correspondents, and only one as far as we know, who suggested to Darwin that there might be an alternative view of God to supernaturalist theism. And that person was Charles Kingsley, the English novelist, who was also a vicar, Church of England vicar. And he wrote to Darwin, and he said this: "I have gradually learned to see that it is just as noble a concept of deity to believe that he created," I'm sorry to use the word he, but I'm just quoting here, "he created primal forms capable of self-development into all forms needful. Is just as noble to believe that as to believe that he required a fresh act of creation to supply the lacunae which he himself made." And Darwin wrote, at least Kingsley wrote a book called The Water Babies, which was written for his children just 4 years after the publication of The Origin of Species. And he tells us there how God makes things make themselves. God makes things make themselves. They have a creativity themselves, and that has to be recognized. Self-organization, we were talking about this morning. There is no evidence that Darwin appreciated at all Kingsley's attempt to rescue him from the concept of the omnipotent, deterministic God of supernaturalist theism. Now, Darwin is commonly supposed to have shown that there is no room for God or purpose in nature, but he never showed anything of the sort. What he did show, and I think very, very clearly and emphatically, was that existing concepts of design by an external agent were now invalid. One of the very important contributions that science makes to religion is a sorting out, a sifting out. It enables you to shed aside a lot of the unnecessary and superficial and superstitious and incorrect conclusions. I think Darwinism did that. It should have been a mortal blow, I think, to supernatural theism. But John Passmore, the Australian philosopher, historian of philosophy, that's right, in his 1959 book says, "Darwin's theory did nothing to prove that God did not exist, but it did destroy the only argument that many men thought by which God's existence could possibly be established. That is why it encouraged the development of agnosticism." Of course, both Darwin and his protagonist, Thomas Henry Huxley, referred to themselves as agnostics. And I believe Thomas Henry Huxley was the person who invented the term agnosticism. I don't know whether you know, when Bertrand Russell was, at one stage of his life, was put in prison, and he was asked by the prison authorities in England, you had to fill out a form and say what religion you were, and he wrote down agnosticism. And the person behind the screen said, "What is your religion?" And he said, "Agnosticism." And the man behind the screen said, "Well, I really haven't heard that one before, but we're all the same religion, aren't we?" Now I want to say something about what in good Claremont terms, I think one can call postmodern theism or process theism, which is relevant to Darwinian evolution. A great and positive contribution that Darwin's theory makes to our thinking about nature is the role of chance. Why is that so important? Because it closes the door to complete determinism. There are the possibility of accidents, the possibility of choices being made in this sort of world. Darwin never got himself beyond the closed door of determinism, be it a supernaturalist or a materialistic determinism. I think Charles Hartshorne in 1962 hit the nail on the head when he said, and I quote, "There must be something positive limiting chance and something more than mere matter and matter, or Darwinism fails to explain life." Very rarely that I give a talk to any group in which the person whom I wish to quote so much happens to be in the audience, and there he is, Charles Hartshorne, sitting just in the second row from the front at the end of the row. There must be something positive limiting chance and something more than mere matter and matter, or Darwinism fails to explain life. I say the recognition of real chance in nature is a first step away from complete determinism. And it's a necessary step if eventually we're to begin to think about self-determination of the entities and about a degree of freedom in the entities of the creation. Now, let me say a word about chance. First of all, an example. I mean, the real meaning of chance in this context. My first meeting with Charles Hartshorne was a chance encounter, to this extent that it happened to be that a student of mine who was working in the Australian Museum rang up one day and said, "There is a philosopher here who is interested, this is an ornithologist here who's an expert in birdsong, and he happens to be a philosopher also." That's how the conversation went. And I said, "What's his name?" And he said, "It's Charles Hartshorne." And I nearly fell off the end of the telephone, and I said, and the student said to me, "Couldn't we have him around for one evening to lead a discussion on our philosophy of biology?" We met once a week on that. So I rang up Charles Hartshorne, and we became friends from that moment on. And that was pretty much a chance encounter. Neither of these things were designed. It wasn't designed that there should be a student of mine in the Australian Museum looking out for somebody called Charles Hartshorne. There was no design on the part of Charles Hartshorne to see me, and certainly he didn't know of my existence. That was a chance encounter. Now, my encounter with John Cobb was entirely different, because on one occasion I said to Charles Hartshorne, "Who else should I meet in this area?" And he said, "My student John Cobb." And so I was very, very purposive about that. I just wrote a letter to John Cobb and said, "The next time I'm passing through California, can I come and see you?" Chance is a real phenomenon in the world, in human life, in the life of all creatures. Let me give you an example from biology, which I think is very important one to understand. The evolution of resistance by insects to DDT. There's plenty of evidence now that we can interpret it in this way, that the resistance to DDT is due to one or a few genes that change the chemistry of the animal and confer a resistance to it, so it breaks down the DDT and is not poisoned by the DDT. Now, you'd think that if nature wanted to do that trick, what would happen would be that when DDT, this poison, was sprayed onto orchards, and it happened around here, actually in California, I think it was the very, very first time this happened, onto orange trees, you'd think that the thing that ought to happen would be, and I mean, if I were God, I would have had it done it this way, that as soon as they met this nasty chemical, they would change themselves. You see, they would spontaneously change to reject that, to deal with that chemical, to turn it into something that was benign. That's not what happened. What happens, and it's completely Darwinian evolution, it's really quite extraordinary when you come to think of it. There is now plenty of evidence that seems that the gene for DDT, which was a mutant gene, this mutation had been occurring in natural populations of insects out there long time before DDT was a chemical invented by human beings. You see, it's a synthetic thing which didn't occur on the Earth until somebody invented it here. That was being produced, genes were being produced, mutant genes were being produced, which would have conferred resistance to DDT, but what's the point? There wasn't any DDT around. until around about the time of the last World War. Then DDT was sprayed around in the environment here, and most of the insects died. But those that happened to have that little mutant gene, by chance, survived, and they, of course, had offspring because it was a gene, it was genetic. They had an offspring which had the gene, and they survived, and they became the dominant population. Pure natural selection of chance variation. Now, at that particular point, it was very difficult to understand how could nature be producing all these mutations in this enormous number, anticipating chemicals that didn't even exist on the planet. We know a lot more about that since the discovery of the basic nature of the gene, DNA, and so on, the complex structure of the molecule. That means that the molecule can come in an infinite variety of possibilities, infinite variety of ways. It's just constructed so that all sorts of possibilities virtually can be produced. Billions of possible DNAs there are. And the little insect that makes these mutations is just waiting, as it were, for its opportunity for the little mutation to be beneficial. But most of the mutations are deleterious. They don't do any good at all. And that's why for a long time biologists didn't think that mutation would play any role in evolution. They just said all it does in the laboratory, when we have fruit flies in the laboratory, all it does is produce little fruit flies which have the wrong number of wings or have got legs missing or something like that. Because the observation is in the laboratory that they're all deleterious. But if you did the trick which was done and change the environment of your little insects in the laboratory, then you find there are some mutations which confer a benefit on the animal in that new environment. I think genetics in relation to ecology is really a wonderful part of science, because it reveals a lot about the incredible profligacy, if you like, of nature, anticipating all sorts of possibilities. Well, I think we know it's very important to know what we mean by chance, because it doesn't mean without a cause. Now, if the world consists of a multitude of independent creators, that's what we're saying, that there is a degree of creativity within when I talked about self-determination, a degree of freedom, not complete determinism, that means we're talking about entities in creation, every living creature. Go beyond that if you wish, but every living creature certainly has a degree of self-determination. If you're talking about that, it means that there is a multiplicity of creators on this planet. What prevents the whole from becoming completely disordered? And to quote a phrase which Charles Hartshorne used, and which I like to use also, too many cooks spoil the broth. There must be something positive limiting chance. Darwinism rules out the notion of an all-determining orderer who manipulates the scheme, and that opens the door to another concept of ordering. And there are only two ways of ordering. Maybe somebody here will be able to give me more than two ways. There are only two ways. One is the dictatorial form of order, and the other one is the persuasive form of ordering. We're talking about not a dictator, but somehow that there might be a persuader who is somehow coordinating the activity of this multitude of creative agents in the world. Now, I quote Hartshorne here. How could a universal persuasiveness be in an ordering universe? Only if there is something more than mere matter in matter, says Hartshorne. Only if there's something more than mere matter in matter. And what could make matter more than mere stuff for the mechanists? It's this notion of individuals, entities of creation that are responsive to a persuasive influence, that have a degree of self-determination to respond to possibilities of their future. I mean, this becomes very meaningful, I think, when we think of ourselves down. Think of ourselves first. I think the attempt to try and get a picture of the creation by building up from atoms and molecules and then finding human being, it doesn't work. But if you think from the human experience down, and the human experience includes this notion of I have a degree of self-determination. I may be 100% determined by my environment and by my genes, my genes, but there's a degree of self-determination there, and I know what it is to be persuaded to go in this direction rather than that, and that we can get order in society by persuasion, and that works better than a dictatorial form of order, and then apply that down the various levels of creation. The image that I quite like is that of a orchestra, the relationship between the members of an orchestra and the conductor. And I think this came home to me best when I saw a documentary of Leonard Bernstein conducting a rehearsal of West Side Story. So you have the conductor here, and who is actually the creator of the music that's in front of him, and then you have a whole lot of people out there who have different instruments, and they have the same score in front of them, and he's got to coordinate it. Now, every single member of that orchestra has the possibility of, I mean, he could start playing Beethoven if he wanted to, but they don't do that. But they could well play other notes than the ones that are written down here, and they could well do something which didn't have quite the nuance that the composer wanted. And the wonderful thing about that particular documentary, which I think many of you may have seen here because it was made in New York. The wonderful thing about it was that periodically you could get on the face of the conductor the sense that, no, this isn't quite right. The coordination isn't quite right. You over there, stop, you see? I mean, somebody's blowing a flute in a way that should be done like that. And this man responded to everything that was going out there, and they responded to the conductor here. They stopped and started all over again. And at the end, you get this wonderful coordination and harmony of a lot of creative agents being coordinated by a conductor here who wasn't a dictator. I mean, sometimes he looked like it, but he wasn't going to get the response of the crowd unless he persuaded them that this was better than what they were doing. So I say that this is an image of the relationship between a persuasive influence and a lot of creative agents giving an order which wouldn't otherwise be possible. So I've talked about the possibility of two important components in a postmodern theism. One is that the entities of creation have a degree of spontaneity, a capacity to respond. They're not completely determined by anything, not completely determined. And the second component is there is a persuasive influence to which they can respond. It means they respond to the possibilities of their future, the possibilities of the present. And God is the name that is given to that persuasive influence in the universe in this way of thinking. Somebody asked me at Fort Collins a couple of days ago, I mean, mostly they would be rather skeptical of any notion of theism, asked me, well, what is, how do you conceive of God? And I said, well, one of the important things is the notion of the potentialities of the future, the possibilities of the future. The potentialities and possibilities of the future must be somewhere. Must be somewhere. They're not just sort of come out of a vacuum, there must be somewhere. And this is the notion that God isn't somebody who has a whole blueprint out there which is being put into operation, but there are possibilities of the future and possibilities of every moment of the present that are latent. In Whitehead's term, they're in the primordial nature of God. The persuasive God is persuading a creature to be what it can be, and more than it can be, to have an adventure in the possibilities of its own little life in the future. You see what we see. The world out there is not just a world of objects, it's a world of subjects, because we're saying the agents out there, that the individual cells in the trees, and if the few animals around there, I'd say those little animals around there, have a degree of freedom. They're creative agents. They're subjects. They feel the world around them. They feel the possibilities of their little life. They anticipate all sorts of things in their little lives. But the completely mechanistic worldview of a great deal of science excludes the notion, is unable to deal with the notion of subjectivity, of responsiveness, of creativeness on the part of the creature. It excludes the consideration of the subjective and it leaves us to study essentially that which can be weighed and measured. And I don't want to decry science, modern science, in that extent. I'd say it leaves something out, but it's been highly successful in those areas where that particular approach is relevant. In fact, the area where science first began, with steel balls falling down inclined planes, with planets and solar systems. That's machinery, in a sense. I mean, the mechanistic analysis works there. As Lewontin, or Levins and Lewontin at Harvard say, the great success of the Cartesian, the mechanistic method, is a part result of a historical path of least resistance. These problems that yield to the attack are pursued most vigorously. This would include a great deal of molecular biology, of course. Most rigorously, precisely because the mechanism, the method works there. I'm talking about the method that deals with everything out there as objects rather than as subjects. The method works there. Other problems and other phenomena are left behind, walled off from the understanding by the commitment to Cartesianism. The harder problems are not tackled if for no other reason than that brilliant scientific careers are not built on persistent failure. So you won't get a Nobel Prize if you pursue some of these areas, which would be very difficult to tackle. And foremost amongst the issues, I now end that quote, I say foremost amongst the issues that mechanistic science has been able to deal with satisfactorily is the relationship of mind and matter, the evolution of mind and consciousness in the whole process of evolution. What do we know about mind and its evolution, consciousness and its evolution? Very, very little. But I think that these problems lend themselves to investigation through another model besides a purely mechanistic model, one which allows for the possibility of these entities having a subjective aspect to their existence. Now let me say a little bit more about two things. First of all, creativity within the individual entities of creation. In the dominant interpretation of Darwinian evolution, the individual living organisms are treated like machines, devoid of self-motion in any sense and subject only to external forces. Mutation and selection are in that category. Matter for Darwinians is passive, being completely determined by external forces acting upon it. I mean the Newtonian universe. And this is what Whitehead was so critical about when he wrote Science in the Modern World. And he has, I think, a wonderful statement, a very insightful statement about evolution, in contrast to that image that I've just given. And I quote, "A thoroughgoing evolutionary philosophy is inconsistent with materialism. The aboriginal stuff or material from which a materialistic philosophy starts is incapable of evolution. The material is in itself the ultimate substance. Evolution on the materialistic theory is reduced to the role of being another word for the description of the changes of external relations between portions of matter. The only thing you have to study is how bits of matter are pushed and pulled and reorganized. There's nothing to evolve because one set of external relations is as good as any other. There can merely be change, purposeless and unprogressive. The doctrine cries aloud for a conception of organism as fundamental to nature. Organism being contrasted with a piece of machinery. Organism meaning the concept of a degree of freedom, a degree of spontaneity and responsiveness to the environment. Whitehead is saying that machines cannot evolve. They can only have rearranged parts. This is a source of contentious discussion between my friend over there, Chuck Taylor from UCLA, on this issue, because he is involved in creating machines which are going to do what he thinks what these living entities can do. So, I mean, I think that's a very important and interesting adventure and course he's on, and a challenging one. But he has a faith that I don't have about that. I say that You can pull a motor car to pieces, and you have nuts and bolts and all the rest of it, and they're the same nuts and bolts when they're lying on the garage floor as they were when they were in the piece of machinery. You put them back, and you can, if you're clever enough, and you can get your whole motor car again, and it'll work. They're the same nuts and bolts. Nothing happens to them in the rearrangement into a motor car. A living organism is very different from that, because if you take the cell of a brain out and you put it in tissue culture, it's a different cell. It does different things. It is in a different environment, and it depends upon its relationship to the environment it's in. There are all sorts of other examples one can give. I mean, you can do it from genetics. The gene is no longer just a little lump. We used to talk about beads on a chain. They're no longer little beads on a chain. They're not little bits of stuff that remain what they are. They are what they are by virtue of the environment they happen to be in. What they do is different if they happen to be next to some other gene or there's another gene on another chromosome. It's a much more complicated and a much more relational thing. So that one gets the idea that the parts themselves don't remain the same when they're in different wholes. Now, I'm not sure what Chuck Taylor would say about this. I sort of started a conversation with him, but I'm not sure what he'd say about this. But you see, I would say that without knowing very much about complicated computers, I happen to have one which he advised me to get, but he has 32,000 of them linked up. I mean, he knows much more about computers than I do. I only have one. But what I incline to say is, knowing the little bit that I know about computers, that I don't care whether that piece of machinery is made of nuts and bolts or chips and silicon, what have yous, that those little bits and pieces remain the same no matter what part they're in. You'd disagree with that, wouldn't you, Chuck? Yeah, he disagrees. I mean, this is a point of great controversy between, I don't want to say he's a mechanist because he's read a lot of Whitehead and he's been influenced by Whitehead. Perhaps there's something in between us. No, I mean, there's something in between these two concepts. But I haven't yet got a faith that the little parts of a computer change themselves are basically different by virtue of being associated with 32,000 computers as associated with being perhaps in just one computer. Open question, maybe. Our faiths are different. Now, if what I've said has any truth in it, the evolution is not just the evolution of objects. It's not just the rearrangement of parts so that you get a different model of motor car this year from last year. It's not just that at all. It's the evolution of subjects. It's analogous to the development of human being. Human life develops from a child to a mature adult is an evolution of a subject. It's the experience which changes, and that's the only thing that matters, feeling. That's the only thing that matters to me. And that's the basic thing that matters to Chuck Taylor over here. He told us last night. The most important thing in his life in terms of values comes from the family, right, Chuck? Okay, it's the most important thing to me. The relationships, the feelings I have about the world about me. Nothing is more important than that. And what I'm saying is that there is a sort of evolution in an individual human life of the subjective, that richness, I don't know what the curve goes like, but it must go up like that and reaches some sort of peak. With some people it stays. With Charles Hartshorne, it's on a plateau, and it may still be going up, but it's not going down. I have no evidence at the age of 94 that it's going down. It's sort of maybe going up still. He has yet to tell us more and to experience more. But with most people, it sort of goes up like that. And then after the age of 40, it begins to... I was, administering a department when most of your staff at the age of 40 is a terrifying thing, because most of them are realizing that they're not going up like that, they're beginning to go down like that. And who is going to get the next plum job, you see? Who is going down faster than the others? So there's going down like that, and then eventually until experience the feeling of life. Now, all I'm saying is that there is an evolution of the subjectivity, like corresponding to the development on the upscale as in our individual human lives. Now, I go back to Lewontin again. Lewontin's a good friend of mine, and good friend of Chuck Taylor's over here, and he agrees with a lot of this, but a lot of it he disagrees with. But he agrees at this point about the parts don't remain the same. Let me quote. As one moves up a level from atoms to molecules to cells and so on, the properties of every larger whole are given not merely by the units of which it composed, but of the organizing relations. That's the important thing, between them. These organizing relations mean that the properties of matter relevant at one level are just inapplicable at other levels. So the entities change by virtue of their position in the part. This is very relation. This is very Whiteheadian idea. It's true of ourselves. We are what we are by virtue of our relationships. What in this part of the world you talk about as internal relations. The feelings that dependent upon, not being pushed around but by the persuasive influences which we feel in our lives and so on, and the memories of the past related to the anticipation of a future. That's what we're talking about. Now, the point of this discourse is to suggest that cells and organs and organisms are not at all like nuts and bolts in a machine. They have an inner responsiveness to their environment analogous to our inner responsiveness to our total environment that includes the purposes we choose. Another way of saying this is that these individual entities of creation have a degree of self-determination. So in that sense, they have a mind, if you want to use that word, and sentience analogous to what we in ourselves know in our own inner feelings, our own subjective lives. And how far down the scale of nature do you go? And of course, there's a very contentious question, but process thought says there is no dividing line between humans and whatever there is down there, protons or whatever you like to call them. There is a continuity from protons to people. All have a subjective aspect to them. There's no dividing line which you can say at this point mind emerges or at this point consciousness emerges. There is a sort of continuum. That's a minority point of view in the world at the moment. The conventional view is that all these things emerge at some stage in the evolutionary process. Mind emerges from no mind at some particular point. And I quote in contrast to that, one of the few biologists who has thought very deeply about this is Cyril Wright, and he says, "The emergence of even the simplest mind from no mind at all seems to me, at least, utterly incomprehensible. Utterly incomprehensible. There's no possibility of that." And I agree with Wright and Whitehead and Hartshorne and other process thinkers that no line can be drawn anywhere down the line, from protons to people. And I think it's very important that this coming together of our own understanding about the world around us and the world within us is one of the great insights, which I think is shared by the new physics and by process thought. If you read quantum physics, this notion of relation and of internal relations emerges from it. And I say we're having a new view, an image of nature, in which we interpret the within in a similar way to which we interpret that which is outside our own individual entity of being a human being. The world around us, the world within us. Now, it's important, as many people in this room will realize, to make a distinction between the individual entities that are subjects. You see, I don't want somebody always says to me, well, is that a subject? I mean, this table you're standing at, is that a subject? No, it's not a subject. It's not an individual entity. It is, to use the terminology of David Griffin and John Cobb, it's an aggregate of entities, molecules, atoms, what have you. And this thing itself has no responsiveness. It's an aggregate. And what science started off by studying were aggregates, as I've already suggested. And what science still basically studies and very successfully studies is aggregates. I want the next step to be the study of subjects. And very few people have got into that. I mean, Jane Goodall has gone into that by studying chimpanzees and having a sort of rapport with them. Donald Griffin at Rockefeller University has got into this by studying bats and also by writing books about thinking and feeling in animals. But it's only the beginning. I mean, biology is the beginning, what I think the new physics got into quite a way back. But still. I think biology in its history has had some shattering experience. I think Darwinism was a shattering experience to biology. There's a great deal of new thinking had to go on at that time. Now I say it's important to make a distinction between the things that are subjects in this world and those that are aggregates of subjects. They're quite different. And don't ask me what that tree is out there, because we're not too sure. Well, at least it's a little contentious, the tree. It's not like an animal and it's not like an aggregate. It's something in between. What does Whitehead call a democracy of subjects? Yeah. I'm not too happy about that, but there you are. Of course, the important thing is that the law applying to aggregates can be quite different to the laws applying to subjects, because subjects have other categories of feeling and subjectivity which are not taken into account in aggregates. You don't need to. That little exposition was to try and expand a little bit the notion of creativity in the individual entities of creation. So the next bit, the last bit, is on the coordinating persuasive influence in the universe for, in this concept, all individual entities of creation, not the aggregates but the subjects. There's a wonderful phrase in Whitehead: the present is memory tinged with anticipation. What exists now, what we are now, is a memory tinged with anticipation. And what do we anticipate? The answer is the further possibilities of our being. At the heart of the universe, even before there were cells or atoms, there was the possibility of these entities coming into existence. The potentiality of the universe is conceived as cosmic mind. Such a reality is recognized, though not explicitly taken to be God, in Buddhism. In Hinduism it is thought of as Brahman, and Judaism and Christianity is called God. The possibilities of the universe are realities that constitute a continuous lure of creation. That's the notion. That's doctrine, that is Whitehead's doctrine of the divine eros, deliberately choosing the word eros because it has a sort of passionate connotation with it. God persuades the world in a passionate sort of way, confronts the world with what is actual, with what is the world in what it is actually is at the moment, with what is possible for it. It's not the notion of a blueprint at all that has to be imposed upon creation. It is just that there are all sorts of possibilities in the future, all sorts of mutations in the future, and these are could have their little day of birth and flourishing. These are possibilities of the future. It's the immensely sensitive, outgoing lure brooding over nature, says Whitehead. It's the ordering principle at the heart of the universe. Else there would be only chaos. How else account for the order of the universe made up of a multiplicity of creative individual entities? I ask you, that's the question. Now, at some levels, natural selection is an ordering principle, but natural selection works on a whole lot of ordered entities already there, atoms and molecules and cells and what have you. Materialism refuses in principle to take order as a problem. And apart from God, the persuasive God, there is no way to understand how there could be any limits to anarchy implied in the multiplicity of creative agents, none of which are universally influential. It's terribly important that the concept of the divine eros does not mean a supernatural God who could exist apart from any world, who created it out of nothing, who interrupts the order of the world at any particular point, as any omnipotent creature might well do. It doesn't imply that at all. It implies the opposite. God is not a divine mechanic. God is not a manipulator. God doesn't manipulate people. And yet every time I turn on the television and look at some of these televangelists, the message they have to tell us is God manipulates you. Just you're clay in the hands of the potter. No, I'm not. I'm not clay at all. I don't want anybody to mould me. I am moulded by choosing that which persuades me to be what I could be. I talked to a bunch of Australian bishops who were having trouble in their schools, their religious schools in Australia, about creationists from the United States, from California, coming in to pervert us. And they said, what can we do about this? And I gave them a talk about alternatives to this, and they said, you know what they wanted? All of these bishops, about 20 of them, wanted to have it both ways. They say, yeah, that's great. I mean, God is a persuader. Yeah, that's great. But leave us the possibility that God is also omnipotent, and if he and he's restraining himself all the time, and he could blow us all up if he wanted to, but he's just restraining himself. I mean, that to me is a crazy notion. Why do they want to have it? Because they think the most important thing you can attribute to God is absolute power and omnipotent engineering power to push that wall over, to cause the earthquake in California, to wreck San Francisco and Los Angeles and all the rest. But he's just restraining himself all the time. I mean, why do they want to keep that? The notion of omnipotence seems to be absolutely deeply embedded in these traditional theists. That's why I think this book that Charles Hawthorne wrote, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes, is so important. Omnipotence is one of the worst things that has happened in theology. You say that, don't you? Yes, he does. See, he nodded. I'm not misreading. The divine eros, the divine persuasion is not before all creation. It isn't something you think about as setting the world going as Darwin thought. He was quite happy to have a God who started it all going, and then evolution looked after it from that point on. God is not before a creation. God is with the creation. That's why God is with the creation, with all creation. God is involved in the lure in every creative event. That's not a doctrine of the identification of God with the world, pantheism, but God is involved with the world, which correctly is called panentheism. Make the distinction. Now, of course, the ordered universe contains within it much that is disordered and incomplete. Multiple creativity makes some disorder and conflict inevitable. It allows for the possibility of disorder and evil. Holmes Ralston, whom I've quoted before, says that nature is cruciform. It has a cross pattern woven within it. That's the end of that quotation. God does not unilaterally determine any events and could not do so. God cannot stop that particular evil. God cannot stop that particular motor car from running me down. God cannot stop somebody from putting their finger on the nuclear button. God is not of that nature. That's the notion. The question then is, why does God not unilaterally prevent particular evils? It doesn't arise. It doesn't arise because it's not in the nature of God. God doesn't manipulate things of people. God is persuasive, 100% persuasive. He doesn't decide, I'm going to leave persuasion on one side, thank you very much. It's about time I brought you into order in another sort of way by being a dictator. I know some people who try to run a class by saying, yeah, you guy over there, you're very disorderly, I'm going to shoot you. I mean, that gets rid of the disorder to some extent, but it doesn't really. Somehow you've got to deal with the disruptive and these difficult elements in the class and persuade them to come into some sort of creative order. The worldview of the divine is conceded as a persuasive agency and not a manipulative one, should be looked upon, said Whitehead, as one of the greatest intellectual discoveries in the history of religion. It was plainly enunciated by Plato in his view that ideals are effective in the world and that forms of order evolve. Now, there is a second side to this. You see, I've said there is disorder, there is evil, there is misery and so on. What's God do about that? Does God just look on as the persuader of the universe, and there is all the suffering going on, and all the pain and so on, and there's joy also? What's God's involvement there? Precious theology, particularly Whitehead, says there must be another side to God's nature. That God, what he called God's consequent nature, as you well know, what I like to call the divine passion, that God feels the world in all its feelings of joys and sufferings to the end of the universe. I mean, that's constant. The most speculative part of the whole idea in precious theology, I think. That God feels the world in all its feelings, in all its subjectivity, it's all its suffering and all its pain. God is with the creation. You get this view in the New Testament, various parts of the New Testament, and to some extent in the Bible, but it has been soft-pedaled by the church, and I asked the Archbishop of York, number 2 in the divine hierarchy. I said to him, the first article of the 39 articles in the back of the prayer book still says, the very first article is, God has neither body parts nor passions. Why do you say that God has no passions? No feeling? He said, Charles, that's historical. Very difficult in England to change anything because Queen Elizabeth I determined it. I don't know who put that in, probably James I or somebody, but you can't change that, it's history. Well, I think that I'm just briefly mentioning the notion of the divine passion, God as the feeler of the universe. Now, there's the two sides, God the persuader, God the one who doesn't leave the universe on its own at all, God doesn't manipulate it, but God is with it, feeling every feeling to an infinite degree in which words cannot describe. Read Romans 8 if you want a sort of pre-scientific version of what that might be about. Now, finally, can you prove any of this? No, of course I can't. Testability may well apply to the individual sciences. I asked Popper once, Popper, who invented the whole notion of, well, at least made it, I don't know if he invented it, but he made the exposition very clear that science has a boundary, and the boundary is the area in which the process of testability can be carried out. You can do an experiment and you can think up all sorts of experiments, and he would say, in which you're trying to disprove the hypothesis that you invented, though I find most scientists want to prove their hypothesis, not to disprove it. And anyway, you do all these experiments and when you do enough and you find that you haven't disproved the notion, you say the probability is that this is true. That is the way that science works. Can you apply that to this? I doubt it. In fact, I asked Karl Popper, when he was at one of our meetings in Bellagio, I said, do you think that there is any meaning to be found beyond the boundaries of what can be tested in that way? And his answer was, yes, of course there is. This is what science has been successful in. So there is an area out there which is more foggy, more difficult to get your teeth into, but nevertheless there is meaning to be found out there. You may not be so sure about it as you are with some scientific meaning. Yes, that's true. There are other criteria for accepting a notion, and I think I use the concept of the criteria of harmony, the extent to which your hypothesis, your picture, ties together your experience, your understanding of the world from all possible sources, from science and from religion, whatever you want, philosophy, whatever you want, what else to bring in it, and it brings some sort of unity to it, and keep this as a tentative hypothesis by which you live in the world. Not saying, I have discovered the truth, because there is yet more to be discovered, that's yet to be changed, the same way as science is moving. So theology ought to be moving also, and that's one of the important things about process theology. It doesn't say it was all written down once and for all to the saints. It is developing now in all sorts of directions, and the future is open. Terribly important. Haven't it cut and dried and defined? We have some principles and frameworks within which to work and discover a new understanding of the complex world in which we live. And Whitehead says that in the very first pages of Process in Reality, that you have these great explorations, these great ideas, and as you quoted, you come down to earth and you test them out again, and you see whether it is harmonious together, and if it is, then you have a greater confidence. So I feel very flattered that I'm the one who's been asked to talk about this and expound it in what I hope is a Whiteheadian, a Hartsonian way, to some extent, of course, a Whiteheadian way, to do it in a place which is the world centre of thinking on this subject. Why do you ask for the ultimate ends of the universe to talk about it when it's all derived from here? Anyway, thank you very much for putting such confidence in me.
We have time for one question. Make it good. Joseph. Charles.
My question is in 3 parts.
No Trinitarians allowed here.
It has to do with the issue of hope, because you related evolution to theology so much. I kind of think that most people in primal worlds tended to believe in a supernatural, omnipotent God because they could see that the righteous did suffer and die, whereas the wicked prospered. And so people could sit down and think, gosh, there must be a way out of this. And I'm also thinking of the religion of slaves, even in this country, where people tended to believe, most of the slaves tended to believe in an omnipotent God because they had to hold on to that for the reason that if the slave master is doing this to me, there must be a God who should take this slave master to task at some point in life. And if not, then there is no hope for us at this moment. I'm just trying to say, I've been conveying so much because I stay around here so much that this idea of omnipotence doesn't really make real good logical sense. However, I also look and read these other history, particularly of people who really suffer, and they seem to necessarily always come up with a God who is omnipotent, all-powerful, so that this God will be able in the end to deal with the oppressor. I just want to figure out, if we take the position, like most of us versus people who want to take that omnipotence is out necessarily, what is there as far as hope is concerned for the sufferer? Now I know you're going to say, God suffers, then what? If I'm really being oppressed and God is suffering with me, yes, it's comforting, but then I'll still be in my oppression, right? So the question I'm trying to raise is, could there be a way, because I raised the same question for David, there wasn't enough time for him to answer, but could there be a way where there could be hope somewhere for the sufferer when it comes to things like this, apart from God just suffering with me? Is there anything more, or that's it? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I understand, yeah. Very, very important question. I agree with you that the fact that somebody is suffering with you isn't 100%. I mean, it's a great support and help, but it still leaves open the fact that you are still suffering. And I have just left a friend in Australia who has had the most terrible experiences in life in terms of suffering, both with his parents. He's aged 28, and he was in a motor car accident which he was nearly killed, and his brother was killed, and the religion outfit that he belonged to, the brethren, said that there must have been some evil in his life, that sort of happened to him, and it's caused terrible pain. I mean, he tried to commit suicide a couple of times. And I said to him, what is it that keeps you going on? I mean, your life is full of suffering and pain and all sorts of accidents that haven't happened to me. And he said it is only the hope that the possibilities of the future, that it may change. And I think I have been able to help him a little bit in seeing what the possibilities might be and to getting a motivation for something new that arises out of suffering, and that he triumphs in spite of the suffering, and that this is, after all, to me, what the image of the cross is. That the cross wasn't the end, the cross was the beginning of life for the people who were following Jesus. So that I think suffering and the cross are an integral part of human life, and yet the possibilities of the future, even in the midst of suffering, are also a possibility for some, but not for everybody. I mean, it wasn't the possibility much for the people who were in Auschwitz, who were against the wall in which they were being shot. And so you ask the question which Professor Chiwaki was asking the other day, is there any justice? And that is a question that has to be asked and asked and asked again. I don't know quite what the answer is. I mean, Jane McDaniel's book, God and Pelicans, tries to deal with that problem in relationship to the animal suffering. It's a very important question. And I don't know the complete answer to it all, but I think there are some lines on which one can think.
Two announcements, one in-house. Panel members who signed up for lunch yesterday, follow me, I'll take you to the room. The rest of you, if you don't know, this is part of a conference that's going on. Come back at 1 o'clock and there will be a continuing discussion of Birch's lecture. Joseph, if you didn't like the answer, come back in an hour, ask the same question, the answer will have changed.